The fate of the majority of regular humans, ungifted individuals, and non-inoculated subjects within the dead zone was to suffer a cruel and inhumane torture at the hands of the corruption that without a doubt would be considered inconceivably horrendous by every measurable standard available. However, a particularly diabolic and heinous fate was reserved only for the females of Louisiana, who under the influence of inexorable evil became subject to a fate so horrifying, even death itself would seem a blessing. Among some of the most dangerous entities within the corrupted areas of Louisiana was the result of mutilated female anatomy, which produced one of the most harrowing tales of suffering ever observed within the bayous. Serving as one of the primary means of spreading the corruption, but also warding off potential threats to the Sculptor, the Hives, as they came to be known, stood out as terrifying walking pillars of everlasting torture and death, essentially being walking beehives, containing within them an endless army of venomous bees, insects, and bugs, each filled to the brim with the very essence of the corruption. The hives would contribute to the spread of sickness, disease, and death within the bayous. Their bone-chilling screams and relentless swarms made them a nightmare for any hunter brave, foolish, or reckless enough to stumble within their reach. However, while the specific patient zero story of many of the Sculptor's creatures within the dead zone remains shrouded in mystery, left forgotten to time, or never observed or recorded at all, the events revolving around the hive stands out among them all. For in this rare occurrence, it would seem that we have not only observations, but personal, first-hand testimony of someone who wasn't just an observer, but a potential victim themselves. Ada Ruth Shell was a hunter within the American Hunters Association who witnessed what is believed to be the very first creation of the original hive. Her personal testimony gives us a deep insight into the creation of this atrocious nightmare. As she recalled, during the summer of 1895, on her birthday, in the midst of July, she, Justice Avis Jr., the son of Avis Sr., the man who would later become Scrapbeak, mentioned that that particular summer was unusually hot and humid. It seemed almost impossible to breathe, as if the air itself was liquid. Not only that, the swamps were swarming with insects, far more than usual. Ada was sitting in her living room with her siblings, which by her own account was a very generous description of the raggedy and decaying shanty the family was living in. Her mother was sitting in the corner of the living room, fanning her face while nervously chewing on her finger, a nervous habit she usually exerted. Having recently lost her newborn child, as well as her husband, Ada's mother was visibly distressed and not in a good place mentally. Having to care for 7 children on her own, times were tough, to say the least. Watching her mother chew on her finger while fanning her face, Ada noticed a fly that crawled up her mother's finger before it went into her mouth. Ada was taken aback as her mother, unfazed by the fly, kept chewing and fanning, her empty eyes staring into nothing. Then, more flies would show up, more and more of them. Then moths, bees, and a seemingly endless amount of other bugs and insects. They filled the room, cluttering the air, the buzzing as loud as a sawmill as Ada covered her eyes and mouth, trying to keep the insects away. Her mother, however, stood motionless in the middle of the room, chewing, fanning, chewing, and fanning as the flies crawled into her ears, into her nose, and into her mouth, and down her throat. Having cowered in the corner, Ada covered her eyes, ears, and mouth, and over the angry sounds of buzzing wings and her siblings' crying screams, a violent snap suddenly tore through the cacophony, then another, and another, each louder than thunder. Before a crack so loud and violent erupted, Ada thought the roof to the house had collapsed. As Ada opened her eyes, she saw her mother standing in the middle of the room. Her spine had been broken in half. Her now twisted and mangled body hung down her side. Her ribcage ruptured and exposed, from where a large beehive protruded, which all of the flies, bees, and insects were now circling. The ceaseless agony painted on her mother's twisted face burned herself onto the retina of Ada's eyes, as the head, now hanging almost upside down, was stuck in a gut-wrenching and perpetual scream that tore through Ada's eardrums. Never pausing, never breathing, her mom's screams were relentless. Confused, terrified, and in a panic, Ada froze. The visual terror of her mother snapped and broken in half shook her to her core. Though she didn't remember much of what happened, she somehow managed to get out of the house. All she remembered was the screams of her mother and the cries of her two siblings as the furious swarms of bees and bugs descended upon them. As they ran out of the house, thousands of stings and bites tore into them, each piercing their frail juvenile skin, injecting them with lethal venom, over and over and over again. And while they tried to run, they didn't make it far. The involuntary sacrifice of Ada's two siblings had given the rest of them a chance to escape, leaving her mother and the swarms behind. Ada took all of them to the Jackson Asylum, where they were treated for shock and superficial damage. However, when the medical examiners treated Ada, they noticed something odd. Though only 13 years of age, and personally claiming to never have had relations of any sort, Ada was 3 months pregnant, an impossibility she described to be nothing short of a miracle. For as she said herself, she was the Virgin Mary. While the reasons could be many, though none substantiated through journals or testimonies, the doctors and medical professionals decided to remove the embryo from Ada's body. But what they found inside of her was nothing like a regular fetus. Though the embryo was allegedly 3 months old, at least according to its size, visually, it didn't resemble a human at all. Described as a hard piece of dead, chewed-up wood, the fetus resembled more a beehive than anything. Unbeknownst to Ada, the nurses, and the doctors, the removal of this odd fetus had not only saved Ada from suffering the same horrendous fate as her mother, it had also saved everyone else within the asylum. It would seem that in the early days of the corruption, before the American Hunters Association was introduced to the protective inoculum created by the dreaded Hunter Lynch, which granted immunity against most of the influence of the other side, the effects of darkness had the ability to impregnate females within the dead zone, turning their bodies into hosts for this atrocious nightmare that would stay hidden within them before tearing them apart in unspeakable and excruciating agony. Years later, despite suffering immense psychological trauma under the wings of the AHA, trained in marksmanship and inoculated to resist the corrupting effects of darkness, Ada ventured back into the bayous. She had heard her mother was still alive, if you could even call it that. Ada wanted only one thing: to set her mother free. The screams from that fateful day still followed her with every step she took. The suffering of her mother was almost unbearable. Now, with her training and rifle, she would finally silence the screams, both her mother's and the ones in her head. It didn't take long within the humid swamps of Louisiana, back where she had lost her mother, her two siblings, and what she had considered a normal life, before Ada once again heard the screams in the distance. Immediately, her entire plan fell apart. Her hands trembled and body shook as she suddenly felt 13 again, and she was back in the living room, covering her ears and eyes, trying to block out the world around her. As she finally composed herself and opened her eyes, she saw the mangled husk of her mother stumbling through the swamps in front of her. Ada let out a gasp, not just because it was a sickening sight, but because of the resemblance. She had never known. It was like looking into a mirror. Ada looked exactly like her mother. In the same second as Ada's realization, her mother noticed her presence. The hive let out a tremendous scream that tore through the swamps as she released a massive, unrelenting cloud of angry bees. Trembling, Ada raised her rifle, trying to force herself to pull the trigger. However, the mother's gaze and terrifying screams crushed her spirit. As she carelessly let off a round, it missed, and in the same second, the swarm of insects engulfed her. An excruciating pain stunned her as 1,000 stings and bites tore into her body. Her mouth and nose and eyes were filled with wings, legs, and mandibles as the swarm of angry bees tore into her. Her blood burned from the injected venom, and her skin felt like it was being pulled apart. The exposure would have instantly killed an irregular human, but the inoculum had not only granted her supernatural strength, but also a powerful resistance to toxins, giving her just enough will and tenacity to escape from her mother's grasp. Though she managed to get away from the swarm, leaving the bios behind her, the venom had proven too strong and she collapsed by herself on the brink of death. When she came to, she woke up inside a medical facility, missing an arm. While the nurses and doctors had been able to save her, the arm had been mutilated to such degree that amputation had been necessary. The other hunters sitting in the room with her explained that the situation within the zone had changed. The swamps were not the same as when she was 13. The corruption had worsened, and where there once only existed a single hive, there were now dozens, if not hundreds, all with the same screaming face of Ada's mother. Ada got up and asked for her rifle. Though the others warned her not to go back, Ada wouldn't listen. It didn't matter that she had lost an arm. She didn't care. As long as she could raise and fire her rifle, she could still fulfill her destiny. No matter how many of them there were, Ada was determined. She was gonna go back. She was gonna grant her mother peace. She was gonna silence the screams. Each and every one of them. Hey there, Hazmat here. That concludes the story of the Hives, which might be my favorite entry within the lore of Hunt Showdown. There's just something so fascinatingly morbid about the Hives and their creation. But anyways, as always, a big thanks goes out to the Hunters Lounge on Patreon, specifically exclusive supporter Johnny Sevens, VIP Jim and L Bob, Corey Peterson, Derivative, Ryan, Goose, Doug Powell, Hambone, Gino Lucero, Slip, Stas Biestek, The Wizard of Copper, and the regulars, Bubonic MCCC, Eli the Great, Gabe Benavides, Ghosty, Jane Doe, Jose Gonzalez, Kashi Yuka, Nightingale Farr, Raven, Sir Bottoms, Spooks, The Loaf of Bread, Tim Wright, Tom Hengst, Wolfie Elström, and Wildcard. The Hunters Lounge does not only support me directly as a content creator, they also help me decide on future content, and you can join it for as little as $1 a month. The link is in the description below. I would also like to give a big thanks to Tip from the official Hunt Showdown Discord. And of course, thank you all for watching. I'll see you in the next one.